What's up YouTube? It's the one and only Legend of Winning, aka Low, and I'm back with a video that is well overdue. In a relatively short amount of time, the NBA has produced a near endless amount of stars that have been very impactful and influential within their time in the league. From this impressive list, people will naturally just rank these greats amongst one another. And from said ranking, unfortunately, we will have some players who are forgotten and overlooked. But naturally, we will also have players who are overrated. And in today's video, that is who I will be highlighting. A player who has amazing statistical feats. But unfortunately, too often do you have people lack context when looking at these numbers. A player whose durability and longevity can rival practically anyone amongst all sports across the board. But unfortunately, too many people do not make this argument and instead disguise it as a skills gap between this player in contrast to the rest of his peers. And a player that many people view as a top 50 player of all time, including myself. However, as of late, I have seen him climb the rankings to the point where many people would put them in their top 30. Some even have him as high as a top 20 player of all time. And that player is John Stockton. Now, unfortunately, when making these type of videos, I have to make sure there's a clarification on what overrated means. A player being overrated does not necessarily mean that I'm going to put into question their skill set and accomplishments, but more so put into question the perception of the player in contrast to other all-time greats. And to be a bit more transparent and so you can understand where I'm coming from, over the past few months with the NBA season suspended, there have been quite a few media outlets who have given their opinions on how they perceive some of the all-time greats. And when it comes to John Stockton, quite often do I see him in the conversation of being a top 30 player of all time. And to go even further, one of my own peers in Jimmy High Roller put Stockton in his top 20 of all time, which to me is a bit outrageous, and honestly I don't believe too many people share that same opinion. However, I am of the belief that majority of people view John Stockton as a top 30 player of all time, and specifically when it comes to ranking him amongst other all-time great point guards, he is quite often viewed top 5 in those regards, which in my opinion is overrating him. But before I get into my opinions, as I always do, let's first get the facts out of the way. John Stockton is a 6'1" point guard that spent his entire 19-year career playing for the Utah Jazz. Now, within that near 2-decade stretch, Stockton was known for many things: efficiency, defense, and durability, but the one aspect of his career that stood out the most was his passing ability. To further highlight his prolific skill set, Stockton led the charge alongside Karl Malone and head coach Jerry Salome in a very heavy pick-and-roll style offense that would further push and promote influence from the point guard position that quite honestly just wasn't seen before the 80s. And because of his skills, patience, and timing, Stockton has more than enough proof that he is indeed one of the greatest passers the league has ever seen. To this day, Stockton holds the record for the most assists recorded in NBA history and holds this record by a fairly wide margin. Also, he led the NBA in assists for 9 years, which is the most in NBA history, and the record for the highest assist average for a season belongs to Stockton as well, which he accomplished in the 1990 season where he averaged 14.5 assists a game. Speaking of which, during his prime, Stockton would routinely record a roughly around 13 to 14 assists to go along with his 16 to 17 points, roughly 2.5 to 3 steals, while shooting north of 50% from the field. And even if you were to widen the scope for the best 10-year stretch in Stockton's career, those numbers really don't change that much. And speaking of consistency, throughout his career, Stockton made a postseason appearance for every year he was in the NBA. When it was all said and done, Stockton had a career average of 13 points, nearly 11 assists, 2 steals, while still shooting above 50% from the field. He also ended his career as a 10-time All-Star, an 11-time All-NBA recipient, made the defensive team 5 times, led the NBA in steals twice, and also holds the record for most steals in NBA history, again by a fairly wide margin. But again, even with that type of resume, which I will openly admit, it is very impressive, it's just not enough to have Stockton as high as many people have him on their all-times lists. And here's why. Now first, let's talk about accolades, because it will help us define what we should expect from a resume of a player who many people are claiming to be a top 20 to 30 player of all time. So when it comes to John Stockton, he was a 10-time All-Star, made the All-NBA team 11 times, made the All-Defensive teams 5 times, led the league in steals twice, and led the league in assists 9 times. However, he never was a Finals MVP recipient, never won a championship, never was named Defensive Player of the Year, or did he win regular season MVP. Now, while doing research for this video, I saw some people make arguments that despite some of the more coveted awards escaping John Stockton's grasp throughout his career, his accomplishments are more than enough to justify his rankings. And quite honestly, that's just not true. For example, when it comes to the regular season MVP, not only did John Stockton never receive this award, but he was never considered to be a candidate throughout his career. The highest that Stockton has ever finished in an MVP race is 7th, and for a majority of his career on a year-to-year basis, he wasn't even considered a top 10 candidate. Now, the reason why I highlight this is because it's really difficult to make an argument that a player who not only never won an MVP but was never a candidate for the award should be a top 30 player of all time when there are 34 players in NBA history who have been named regular season MVPs. Now, I'm pretty sure there will be plenty of people who will make the argument that it is extremely difficult for Stockton to win an MVP or even be a candidate for the award thanks to the role that he played alongside Karl Malone. However, I would point out 2 things. A, it's difficult but not impossible. We've seen this before where players playing second fiddle to another all-time great and still is considered an MVP candidate, such as Russell Westbrook in 2016, Scottie Pippen in 1996, and heck, even Kobe Bryant in 2003 when he finished 3rd in the MVP race ahead of Shaq. But also, and more importantly, that kind of proves my point. John Stockton was never the best player on the teams that he was featured on. So to put a second option ahead of players who are leading their teams to championship caliber seasons, again, is very difficult to do. Furthermore, if we were to look at the rest of his resume with his all-star appearances and his all-NBA and all-defensive team selections, again, you would come to the conclusion how common it is in NBA history for players who have very similar accomplishments. First, when it comes to all-star appearances throughout NBA history, there have been 40 players to be selected to at least 10 all-star teams. When it comes to all-NBA selections, there have been 25 players who have made at least 10 of those teams throughout their careers, and this does not include players such as Kevin Garnett, Dwayne Wade, and Moses Malone, and also this does not include players such as Kevin Durant, James Harden, Russell Westbrook, and Stephen Curry. All 4 players have a really good chance of finishing their careers with 10 All-NBA selections under their belt. And then when it comes to all defensive teams, there have been over 40 players throughout NBA history who have made at least 5 of these selections, and this does not include players such as Patrick Ewing and Shaquille O'Neal, who are systematically at a massive disadvantage when it comes down to making all defensive teams. This can also be stated about Patrick Ewing when it comes to all NBA selections. Also, this does not include players such as Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain, who spent majority of their careers playing through the 50s and 60s, where the award just did not exist since it was introduced into the league in 1969. Now again, the reason why I am highlighting the amount of players who have seen similar success when it comes to the amount of accolades that they've received throughout their careers is just so we can get a definition of the baseline standard of what we would consider to be a top 50 or a top 30 player of all time. So even though, yes, Stockton does have an impressive resume, quite honestly, it's just not enough, especially if you're trying to make an argument for him being a top 30 player of all time, when there have been more than 30 MVPs in league history, and that list of players doesn't even consider some all-time greats such as Jerry West, Isaiah Thomas, and Dwayne Wade. And even when looking at all of those players, majority of them have not only won a championship, but also won Finals MVP as well. Awards that not only John Stockton never received, but quite frankly, was never considered to be a recipient at any point of his career. But as many of us are aware, that's not the argument that most people make when it comes to John Stockton, because the argument that many people make when it comes to Stockton has everything to do with the numbers. Now, when it comes to Stockton and his statistical accomplishments, quite honestly, they are impressive, and there's no need for me to sit here and belittle them whatsoever. So that's not my problem. The problem that I have is when people give inaccurate depictions solely based off of numbers, which has always and unfortunately will be a problem in the NBA community when lacking context. And when it comes to John Stockton, he is glorified to a whole nother level simply based off of stats that quite frankly never led to any significant type of winning. Now, when it comes to every other statistical category, everyone acknowledges that longevity, the role that you had, and your teammates will all play a factor on where you end up at the end of your career statistically. However, people can still utilize context and make judgment calls based off of the skill set rather than the numbers. For example, when it comes to Larry Bird, he is easily one of the greatest scorers of all time, despite the fact that he's nowhere near the top of the leaderboard when it comes to career points, and also he never led the league in scoring. Now, how is this? Well, he was on teams that always had other competent scorers, and also he didn't have a long career, so there was no way that he was going to rack up as many points as other players. And if you use that same train of thought with John Stockton, as well as the rest of the all-time great point guards, you'll clearly come to a logical conclusion to why Stockton has so many assists in contrast to everyone else. John Stockton was one of the more durable players in NBA history, so his longevity is practically unmatched amongst anyone else the league has ever offered. Also, John Stockton played on teams with competent scorers, such as Karl Malone, Thurl Bailey, Jeff Malone, and Jeff Hornacek. But more importantly, Stockton played in a system that was predicated on pick and roll execution, a style of offense that not only will inflate practically any point guard's assist numbers, but also the system is so simplistic that all Stockton had to do was commit on very rudimentary passes that would have translated to easy assist numbers. Now, is that Stockton's fault, or am I saying that he lacks skills? Absolutely not. But context is needed, especially when people are making arguments that he somehow is undeniably the greatest passer of all time, solely based off of his numbers. Because if we're being honest with ourselves, other players, especially all-time greats, could have put up similar numbers to John Stockton if put in similar situations. However, a player like Magic Johnson, in his first few years in the NBA, he wasn't even the starting point guard. He was playing in a backcourt with Norm Nixon, and because Nixon had the ability to handle the ball and facilitate, Magic Johnson's assist numbers were relatively low compared to what he was able to post once the Lakers decided to trade Nixon away and bring in Byron Scott. Did Magic Johnson all of a sudden acquire some passing skills that he never had before within 1 year's time? No. It's just a team that he played on, the role that he had, and the system that he was trying to execute changed dramatically within 1 year's time. And even if you want to look at someone who isn't considered an all-time great passer, look at Raymond Felton. Raymond Felton, for his first few years in the NBA, averaged around 5 or 6 assists. Then he signed with the New York Knicks, who were coached by Mike D'Antoni, and his assist numbers shot up to 9 a game. But then, during the middle of the 2010 season, he was traded to the Denver Nuggets, and his assist numbers went right back down to 5 or 6 a game. Did Raymond Felton magically acquire some skills that he somehow lost in the middle of the season for him to go to 5, 9, and back to 5 assists a game? No, it was a system that he was in. That's it. But it still gets worse, because for whatever reason, John Stockton gets uplifted in these conversations just because he is the best traditional point guard, which doesn't make any sense. I've already discussed this in a previous video, so I will be brief, but this ideology that the only way that you can be a true point guard or a traditional point guard is if you accumulate a certain amount of assists while holding yourself back from scoring XYZ amount of points. It's ridiculous, especially when point guards who played before John Stockton, you know, the players who would be building the tradition to determine what a great point guard is or is not, were elite level scorers and very rarely averaged 10 plus assists. But somehow John Stockton came into the league and redefined what a traditional point guard is supposed to do, despite the fact that his style of play never translated to an MVP nor championship. Now, I've already stated this, and I do believe it's very impressive that throughout Stockton's career, he always made an appearance in the postseason. Again, very impressive. However, very similar to my accolades section, making the playoffs on a year-to-year basis to be a top 30 player of all time just isn't enough. If you go back and you look at many of the all-time great players, most of them have a win percentage of 60% or higher during the regular season, which is why we utilize postseason success to identify the difference from some all-time greats, like the difference between Chris Paul and Steph Curry, or James Harden and Dwayne Wade. And quite frankly, when it comes to John Stockton, and honestly we can throw Karl Malone in this argument as well, this is where they fall short miserably. Now, of course, many people are just going to point out that, hey man, it's unfair to point out postseason failures because they had to go up against the GOAT. That's the reason why they didn't win any championships. And again, this argument irritates me because for whatever reason, yet again, people are ignoring longevity and durability in these conversations. John Stockton made a postseason appearance every single year of his career. So when it comes to the postseason failures, it has way more to do with other players than just Michael Jordan. And so when I started to do my research, I started to realize that those Karl Malone and John Stockton led Utah Jazz teams, not only do they have a losing record in the playoffs, but also they have more first round exits than conference finals appearances. Mind you, these Utah Jazz teams used to routinely win 50+ games, which means when they got knocked out in the first round, they had home court advantage and still lost. And before anyone sits here and tells me, oh, it's a team sport, so they didn't have a good enough team. Throughout the late 80s up until 93, not only did the Utah Jazz feature John Stockton and Karl Malone, but they also featured Mark Eaton. In that time frame, he was named to 5 all-defensive teams and won 2 Defensive Player of the Years. Also, these teams featured competent third options, players who had the ability to score around 15 to 19 points on a night-to-night basis. So don't tell me that these are rosters that aren't talented enough to get past the first round, especially when the 2 players who are leading these cast of players are allegedly 2 top 30 or 2 top 20 players of all time. That just doesn't make any sense. But wait, it gets worse, because when we specifically are referring to John Stockton, in these postseason series, he's getting outperformed rather routinely. And again, it's not by Magic Johnson or Isaiah Thomas, some of the greatest point guards of all time, right? No. It's by Kevin Johnson, who was great at his peak, but not an all-time great. It's Terry Porter, who was also really good at his peak, very underrated, but again, not an all-time great. Heck, sometimes it was even by Kenny Smith. And these players are not only having some of, if not the greatest series of their career while being matched up to John Stockton, but some of them are just flat out outperforming Stockton on a night-to-night basis during these series. So with all that being said, people, let me leave you on this note. I cannot say this enough, but John Stockton is one of the greatest players of all time. Top 50 in my opinion, and I also put him in my top 10 point guards list as well. But you cannot make an argument that an individual is supposed to be top 30 all time just because he systematically benefited from an offense while also playing alongside an all-time great player in Karl Malone that thus gave him a blanket of privilege that never allowed him to have the responsibility to actually lead a basketball team as the best player on the roster. And to be completely transparent, I'm already expecting people to tell me how I'm disrespecting John Stockton. But quite frankly, I think everyone who puts John Stockton in their top 30, especially in their top 20, are disrespecting players who have accomplished more than Stockton. Regular season and final MVP recipients, champions, players who have more all-defensive teams, players who are more impactful. Those are the players that I'm referencing to. Stockton was great. His resume is amazing, but unfortunately, it's just not good enough to put him in the top 30. But with all that being said, people, please let me know what you think about the video in the comment section below. I know for a fact I'm going to get a lot of comments, so let me hear your thoughts and opinions. And until next time, I'll see you all later. Peace.